Now, I think the Viltrox 23mm f1.4 is the single best lens that you can buy for the Canon M50. And I think that for a number of reasons. And the first one is the focal length. 23mm is generally considered the perfect all-purpose single focal length on a camera with a sensor of this size. That's because you can do so much with a 23mm lens on this camera. And this is everything from sort of landscape photography to street photography to environmental portrait. 23mm also means that you can get a very good image of a sort of a close-up of somebody sort of head to shoulders or head to sort of torso, getting close to them and get a sort of reaction shot or a facial expression or even a couple of people together reacting to something. And you don't have to get so close that you have to get right in their face where you're sort of really, really noticeable, like you might with something like a 16mm lens. So at 23mm, you can get that close-up shot, but you can also back away and get that wide shot. It just really is kind of the Goldilocks sweet spot of focal lengths on the Canon M50 Mark II. Now, obviously, it is a fixed focal length, which means you only get 23mm. So if we think that we want the most versatile lens with the most versatile focal length, why wouldn't we look at a zoom lens? And a zoom lens is great for versatility. There's no doubt about that. The problem is you can't get a zoom lens which has an f1.4 aperture. And the fact that this lens has an f1.4 aperture gives us a couple of things. The first thing is it allows us to get a very, very blurry background. And with the Canon M50 at 15mm, that lens will only open to an f3.5 aperture. That doesn't get you a very blurry background. f1.4 gets you a significantly more blurry background. In addition to this, the fact that the aperture opens wider means that we get more light in. So if you're in a situation where you're out with the kit lens, whether you're shooting sort of photo or you're shooting video, you might find situations where the light is so low that the camera has to use its ISO by cranking that ISO up really high, and you get this sort of gritty, grainy, sort of horrible, almost staticky looking image. And that is one of the challenges with the Canon M50. It doesn't really have the best high ISO performance. But because this lens has an aperture of f1.4 and it can open up really, really wide and let so much more light in, it means the camera doesn't have to work as hard. It means the camera doesn't have to crank its ISO up to actually see that image. So the net result is you're going to get a much cleaner, much sharper, much more detailed image. The other thing about getting blurry background photo and video with this lens is the fact that you are going to get a very high quality of background blur. Now, there's a lot of lenses out there that will give you an f1.4 aperture. And a lot of those lenses will also give you a sharp, detailed image in the subject that you're focusing on. But very importantly, that is only part of the image you're seeing. The out of focus areas, particularly with sort of portraits or environmental portraits that you might do with a lens like this, or even street photography, those background and out of focus elements actually end up making up more of the image than the in focus elements. So it's absolutely critical that that background blur is sort of creamy and beautiful and smooth and not sort of jagged and distracting. And that is one of the best features of pretty much all the Viltrox lenses. They render this very, very beautiful background blur, this very beautiful bokeh. So it's not just the sharpness and the fact that you get all that light in, it's the fact that when you do get a blurry background, it is a very pleasing and very satisfying blurry background. And in addition to the background blur that you get with this lens, you also get an image quality that is just slightly lower contrast. It's just sort of a little bit more cinematic. It's slightly warmer. It's really an interesting image. It's not like a night and day difference from the Canon lenses, but it's just tweaked that little bit in a way that when I bring it into editing, often I'm getting ready to edit or do something with it, and I think, oh, this looks pretty good. There's not a whole lot here for me to do. Now, depending on the way that you like your images, this may or may not suit you. I would suggest that this lens gives you a much more of a filmic look and a little bit less of a digital look or a sharpened look. So it really depends on what you're going for. But for me, I just love the sort of unique image quality you get out of this. And honestly, it's not so different than sort of the generic Canon lenses or the kit lens that you can't just tweak it and turn up that contrast and turn up that saturation if you want to a little bit. But it does give you a slightly different image out of camera that I really, really appreciate. And not only are you going to get this amazing image quality, you're going to get it at a very, very low price. And in the description down below, I've actually put my best price link, so you can go through and it will give you choices of a number of the top suppliers, so you can actually identify who has the best price on this lens right now. And even if this lens costs sort of 2 times the price of what it is now, I would probably still be telling you it's my favorite lens. Now, not only is this an affordable lens, but it is an incredibly well-built lens. It is an all-metal body. It's even got a metal lens hood. It's got a metal mount. Everything about this lens just feels high quality. It's got a really well dampened focus ring, and it also has the aperture ring on the actual lens itself. So you can actually set the aperture for the camera with the lens. Now, ideally, I wish this aperture ring was clicked. It is a declicked aperture ring, which means you don't get firm clicks at the different aperture settings. But having said that, it is a reasonably stiff ring to operate, which means once you set it to the right setting, it's not going to get bumped or come out of the wrong aperture or change to a different aperture value quite easily. So it is going to stay in place, but it is the one little niggle. I just wish it was clicked. Having said that, if you are a video shooter and you plan on shooting in a situation where you're actually going to be changing your aperture in video, that is an advantage of this lens because you won't hear the clicks and you won't have the sort of the fumbly movement when the camera is going click, click, click and you're changing the aperture on the lens. Now, one thing a lot of people worry about with third-party lenses or non-Canon lenses is how is the autofocus performance going to be compared to the Canon lenses? Because obviously it's made by a completely different manufacturer. Well, I can tell you I've used this side by side with my Canon lenses, and I cannot tell the difference. I wouldn't be able to tell you if I was using the Viltrox lens or a Canon lens. The focusing is exactly the same. The other thing that's nice about this lens is on the bottom of the lens, there's actually a USB port, which allows you to update the firmware. So if they decide that they want to update the algorithm, or if a firmware update comes out for your camera, or they release a new camera that doesn't work as well or is less compatible with this lens, Viltrox just releases a firmware update, and all you got to do is just plug your computer straight into this lens. It shows up as like a little hard drive or a disk, and you just drag the firmware and drop it onto the lens. And that's it, you're done. It's probably the easiest firmware updating process that I've ever seen. Now, there's one unique thing that this lens allows you to do that only the Viltrox lenses allow you to do with the Canon M50, and that is shoot aperture priority video. And this is so, so powerful. Now, the Canon M50's always been able to shoot aperture priority photo. And basically, you shoot aperture priority when you're trying to decide how blurry you want the background to be. And with lenses like this, if you're shooting aperture priority photo, generally you would just put the Canon M50 in aperture priority. You would set the aperture to f1.4. Then you can go around and take your photos, and the subject would always be sort of detailed and in focus, and your background would always be blurry and blown out and out of focus. That gives you that great subject isolation where your main subject in the frame just pops out from that blurry background. Now, if you wanted to shoot at an aperture of f1.4 in video without this lens, you have to do all the settings manually. So you have to set your aperture f1.4, then you have to set your shutter speed, and then you have to set your ISO. This becomes very, very difficult. It also means since you don't have an auto capability, when you change different scenes and you move into different lighting conditions, you're going to have to be constantly changing the settings. But because this lens can actually set the aperture for your camera with the ring on the side of the lens, all you need to do is just slide this into f1.4 on the lens. The lens has just decided that, hey, we're going to be running an f1.4. Leave the camera in your normal automatic video mode, and then the camera will make all the other decisions for you about ISO and shutter speed. So now we're shooting in aperture priority video. I can't tell you how powerful that is. And when I am using this lens for video, I'm almost exclusively shooting in this aperture priority video mode. Now, this is absolutely my favorite lens on the Canon M50, but if you're really focused on taking blurry background portraits and you're more of a portrait photographer, then I've just thrown a video on screen now that's going to take you through to my #1 recommendation for a portrait lens for the Canon M50.